Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we're going to get a short and fairly simple overview of the history of medieval Rus, often called Kievan Rus. Medieval Rus, which, like I said, is often called Kievan Rus these days, was this confederation of princedoms and city-states that existed roughly from the 9th to the 13th century. And it included parts of what are now the nations of Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. And you can see the name Rus in both Belarus and Russia. And it is called Kievan Rus because for a lot of that time, the Grand Prince of Kiev was its leader. But control kind of moved around amongst the city-states, and it was more of a loose confederation a lot of the time than what we would see now as a nation state. Nonetheless, it was a somewhat unified political entity, enough so that we can talk of medieval Rus or Kievan Rus. And its ruling family was the House of Rurik, and they were Vikings, probably from eastern Sweden. And this is where we get the word Rus. It probably refers to this Swedish tribe who, in the mid-9th century, came into what is now Russia. And according to the primary chronicle, they were ostensibly invited to rule Novgorod. The Slavs couldn't rule themselves, so goes the story, and so they invited this Viking tribe to rule over them. However, these Rus, these Vikings, became Slavicized, or however you want to call it, switched over to speaking the Slavic vernacular, became part of the Slavic culture there, and they ruled, the House of Rurik ruled medieval Rus and then Muscovy, as we'll see later, for about 700 years. And it is one of the longest running dynasties in all of Europe. And I believe it had something like 21 or 22 lines of succession directly through the male line. So it ruled for a really long time and was quite powerful and controlled. What you can see on this map here is a very large swath of territory, even though what would later become Russia is much larger. Nonetheless, this was still a powerful and large collection of principalities that ruled a considerable portion of Europe. Some of you might be wondering about where we get Cyrillic, where we get the alphabet that is used in a lot of Eastern Europe. And this is important because it shows the Eastern or Byzantine viewpoint or perspective of Eastern Europe. And so in 862, which supposedly was the same year, by the way, in which Rurik was invited to rule over Novgorod, Prince Rastislav of Great Moravia, which is approximately where the Czech Republic is now, asked Byzantium to send a mission to evangelize his people to help convert them to Christianity. And this is important because the Byzantine Church made a practice of translating the Gospels into the local vernacular. Whenever they sent a mission somewhere, they would translate the holy texts into that local vernacular. And they took this very seriously. And so the monks, Cyril and Methodius, who were brothers and who were from Eastern Europe themselves and spoke the Slavic vernacular, we can't really talk of it as Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian or Bulgarian or Serbian or anything like that at this point. It was this Proto-Slavic medieval language. And they spoke the local vernacular, and they began to work on an alphabet and grammar. And the alphabet that they created was called Glagolitic, which comes from this word that means speech or speaking. And the language that they created was called Old Church Slavonic. And it combined the Slavic vernacular with grammatical concepts brought in from Greek, so that they could translate the sort of spiritual and non-concrete concepts that are in the Bible. The Bible is full of abstract concepts that the local Slavic vernacular was not suited to translating, and so they had to create a fair amount of language in order to do this. But they did this, and in 863, they translated the Gospels, traveled to Great Moravia, and started this mission. And one of the interesting things about Glagolitic is that it was specifically created for the sounds of Slavic languages, and it then became the basis of modern Cyrillic. So modern Cyrillic, which, as you might guess, is named after Cyril, who did most of the work, supposedly, on creating this alphabet and this language. Modern Cyrillic is based partially off of Greek, which you can tell if you look at the letters, but it is also created in order to express the sounds of Slavic languages, and so it has a number of its own unique letters, which express these sounds that Slavic languages have, like sh or ch, which are more difficult to express using Latin orthography. So it's actually very convenient to use. Beginning students of Cyrillic using languages are often intimidated by it. It's actually much easier to use than trying to write in English using Latin orthography. So interesting side note, but also important to note this connection with Byzantium that will become very important over the centuries as far as which direction Eastern Europe would take. Would it be a Western-looking region or an Eastern-looking region? The original Slavs were polytheists with their own deities that we know a little bit about now, but not a lot. Unfortunately, they were not literate at the time that they were polytheists, so not a lot of records were kept, and that kind of knowledge was suppressed or destroyed once they converted to Christianity. So we don't know a huge amount about it, but we know that they were these pagan polytheists that worshipped these kind of nature gods, kind of like the Nordic nature gods, the Scandinavian nature gods. They weren't the same, but probably it was something similar to that. However, their ties with Byzantium made them interested in Christianity, and they saw that a lot of the powerful rulers and nations in medieval Europe were Christian. And in the 10th century, Princess Olga the Wise, who was then the regent of Kiev, traveled to Constantinople and converted to Christianity. And just as a side note, one of the interesting things about Rusian, referring to this medieval Rus, and Russian history is the presence of numerous strong female leaders. Although no one would ever claim that Rusian or Russian culture is super friendly to women, they nonetheless have this long tradition of strong female leaders, and we will meet a couple of them, first Olga and later Catherine. And so Olga traveled to Constantinople, met supposedly with the Emperor of Byzantium, converted to Christianity. There's a whole story about how she kind of tricks the Byzantine emperor and shows how clever she is. This is a recurring feature in these Rusian histories, how the Rusians were repeatedly not taken seriously by the more quote-unquote civilized and powerful leaders, but then they would trick them in some way and show their extreme cunning. So Olga converted to Christianity in the 10th century, and then in 988, her grandson Vladimir decided that really Rus needed to get with the times and become a monotheistic nation like all the other powerful nations around him. And he supposedly, according to the primary chronicle, sent out missions to sort of investigate like which were the best monotheistic religions, settled on Byzantine Christianity. And in 988, he converted himself and all of Rus to Christianity. And because of Rus's close ties with Byzantium, the Rusian church followed Constantinople rather than Rome after the Great Schism of 1054, when the Christian church split in two. And so Much of Eastern European Christianity, including Russian Orthodoxy, follows this Eastern Orthodox tradition. And so Russia has its own church, the Russian Orthodox Church, that follows the Byzantine tradition. Medieval Rus reached the apex of its power and consequence probably in the 10th and 11th centuries. By the 12th and 13th centuries, it was starting to fragment and become weaker and more divided. And this all came to a head, or the whole thing came crashing horribly down in 1237 when Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, led an invasion of Rus. And the divided and fragmented city-states were unable to stand together. One would call for aid and the others wouldn't come help them or wouldn't get there in time. And so they were conquered and brutally sacked one by one. Kiev was sacked in 1240 and never recovered. The illustration you see there is of the sacking of Ryazan, the first major city to be sacked. And the result of this was that Kiev was so destroyed and the whole collection of principalities was so fragmented and divided that the seat of power moved north to Moscow. And we're sort of gliding over a couple of centuries of history there. But basically, the seat of power moved from Kiev, which had been horribly destroyed, to Moscow, which had also been sacked, but was such a minor town at the time that it largely escaped massive destruction and was able to rebuild fairly easily. And so the seat of power moved from Kiev to Moscow, and Russia became a much more Eastern-oriented or Asian country. And we'll talk later about how is modern-day Russia, the Russian Federation, is it a European country? Is it an Asian country? The answer is it's kind of both. And so if we see this medieval period, we can see how it started off, these Eastern European tribes being ruled by Swedish Vikings. So it was essentially a Northern European country. Once the Mongol Tatars came in, then it became, in various ways, a much more Asian country. The nobility became closely allied with the Mongols. Of course, they had to in order to survive. They started speaking Tatar. Much of Russian dress was Tatar dress. It was borrowed from the Central Asian dress. And so what had been medieval Rus started morphing from a European Viking country into a Central Asian country, with the seat of power changing from Kiev to Moscow.